The knock on the door came just before dawn, and Alira knew, even before she opened it, that something terrible was about to happen. Two guards stood outside the servant quarters, their armor catching the weak morning light. Behind them stood Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper, her face pale and her hands shaking. "The Duke wants to see you," Mrs. Whitfield said, "now in the main hall." Alira's heart dropped. In 3 years of working at Ashworth Manor, she had never once spoken directly to Duke Alaric. She had seen him from a distance, walking through the gardens with his cold, unreadable face, or riding out at dawn with his guards. Servants like her were meant to be invisible to a man like him. Whatever this was, it could not be good. She followed the guards through the narrow servant corridors, her worn shoes echoing against the stone floor. Every step felt heavier than the last. Had she broken something? Had someone accused her of stealing? Her mind raced through every possible mistake she might have made, but she could think of nothing that would call for the Duke himself. When the guards pushed open the heavy doors to the main hall, Alira stopped breathing for a moment. The hall was full of people, not servants but nobles. Men in fine coats and women in silk dresses stood in small clusters, whispering to one another. Candles burned in golden holders along the walls, and the morning light poured through tall windows, making the whole room glow. It looked like a room prepared for a grand announcement, not for punishing a servant girl. At the far end of the hall stood Duke Alaric Ashworth. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp gray eyes that seemed to look straight through anyone who met his gaze. He wore a black coat with silver trim, and he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, perfectly still, like a statue carved from stone. Alira had always heard the servants whisper about him, how he never smiled, how he had not shown interest in a single woman since his father's death, how the whole court had given up trying to arrange a marriage for him. Now his gray eyes were fixed directly on her. "Alira," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried across the entire hall. "Come forward." Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, but somehow she walked forward, past the whispering nobles, past Lady Seraphina, who was staring at her with narrowed eyes and a face twisted in disbelief. Alira had seen Lady Seraphina before, always dressed in the finest gowns, always at the Duke's side during court events. Everyone assumed that one day the Duke would choose her. Alira stopped a few steps away from him and lowered her eyes, the way a servant was taught to do. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "how may I serve you?" The hall fell completely silent, even the whispering stopped. Duke Alaric studied her for a long moment. Something flickered behind his eyes, something Alira could not name. Then he spoke words that would change her entire life. "I have chosen my bride," he announced, turning slightly so his voice reached every corner of the hall. "It is Alira." For one full second nobody moved, nobody breathed, then the hall erupted into chaos. "This is absurd," a nobleman shouted from somewhere near the back. "She's a servant," a woman gasped, pressing a gloved hand to her chest. Lady Seraphina's face went white, then red with fury. "Your Grace, surely you cannot mean this. She scrubs your floors." Alira stood frozen, certain she had misheard him. She turned to look at the Duke, searching his face for some sign that this was a joke, a test, or a terrible mistake. But his expression did not change. He looked as calm as if he had simply announced the weather. "I am aware of what she does in this household," the Duke said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "And I have made my decision. It is final." "But Your Grace," an older nobleman said, stepping forward, his voice tight with disbelief, "a duke cannot marry a servant. It has never been done. The court will not accept it. Your own mother will not accept it." At the mention of his mother, a flicker of tension crossed the Duke's jaw, the first real emotion Alira had seen from him. But he did not back down. "The court will accept what I decide," he said simply, "and my mother will learn to accept it as well." Alira's mind spun. This could not be real. Only yesterday, she had been on her knees scrubbing the floor of the East Corridor, dreaming of nothing more than finishing her chores before the cook scolded her for being slow. She had no family name, no dowry, no noble blood. She had grown up in an orphanage on the edge of the city before coming to work at the manor when she was barely 16. She was nobody, and nobody married a duke. "Your Grace," she said, finally finding her voice though it trembled, "I do not understand, why me?" The question hung in the air. Every noble in the room leaned forward slightly, waiting for the answer, hungry for some explanation that would make sense of this madness. Duke Alaric's eyes softened for just a moment, so briefly that Alira almost missed it. "There are things I cannot explain yet," he said quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it clearly. "But trust me when I say this is not a mistake." Before she could ask anything else, Lady Seraphina pushed forward, her silk skirts rustling with anger. "This is an insult," she said, her voice shaking. "To me, to every noble family in this room. You cannot simply pull a servant from the kitchens and place a crown on her head." "I am not placing a crown on anyone's head, Lady Seraphina," the Duke replied coldly. "I am choosing my wife. The decision has been made and it will not be discussed further." Lady Seraphina's eyes filled with tears of fury, but she pressed her lips together and said nothing more. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the hall, her skirts snapping behind her like a whip. The other nobles began to murmur among themselves, casting glances at Alira that ranged from pity to disgust to open curiosity. She felt every single gaze like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the servant quarters where she belonged, where life made sense. But then Mrs. Whitfield appeared at her side, gently touching her arm. "Come, child," the housekeeper whispered. "The Duke has more to say." Alira barely heard the rest of what happened next. She was aware of Duke Alaric explaining that the wedding would take place within the month, that preparations would begin immediately, and that Alira would be moved from the servant quarters to a private chamber in the East Wing that very day. She was aware of nobles filing out of the hall, some in anger, some in stunned silence, casting final glances back at her as if she were a strange creature they had never seen before. When the hall finally emptied, only Alira, the Duke, and a few guards remained. Duke Alaric walked closer to her, and up close, she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, as if he had not slept in days. He studied her face carefully, the way someone studies a puzzle they are trying to solve. "You must have many questions," he said. "I have only one, Your Grace," Alira said, forcing herself to meet his eyes despite every instinct telling her to look away. "Why did you choose me? I have nothing to offer you. No name, no land, no family." For a moment she thought he might actually answer her. His mouth opened slightly, and something like sorrow passed through his expression. But then he closed it again, and the cold mask returned. "You will understand everything in time," he said. "For now, know that you are safe here. No one will harm you while you are under my protection." The word protection struck her strangely. Why would she need protection? She was only a servant. Unless there was something about this decision, something about her, that made her a target the moment his announcement left his lips. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "am I in danger?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the tall windows, looking out at the gardens where the morning mist was just beginning to clear. "There are people in this world," he said slowly, "who would prefer certain truths remain buried. I intend to make sure they cannot succeed." Before Alira could ask what truths he meant, one of the guards stepped forward. "Your Grace," the guard said, "your mother has arrived. She is demanding to see you immediately." A shadow crossed the Duke's face, quick and heavy, like a cloud passing over the sun. Alira watched him straighten his shoulders, the way a soldier prepares for battle. "Take Alira to her new chamber," he told Mrs. Whitfield. "Make sure she has everything she needs." As Mrs. Whitfield led her away, Alira glanced back one last time. Duke Alaric stood alone in the center of the grand hall, staring at nothing, his hands clenched at his sides. For a man who had just announced his marriage to the entire court, he looked less like a groom preparing for happiness, and more like a soldier preparing for a war that had only just begun. Alira did not know it yet, but she was about to become the center of that war, whether she wanted to be or not. And somewhere deep inside her, in a place she had never dared to explore, A small voice whispered that Duke Alaric's strange words about danger and buried truths were somehow connected to the tarnished old locket she had worn around her neck since she was a small child, the one item from her past that she had never been able to explain and never dared to remove. The wedding took place 17 days later, in the small chapel behind Ashworth Manor, far from the grand cathedral where nobles usually married. There were no crowds of cheering townspeople, no banners announcing the joyful union of a duke and his bride. Instead, there was a hushed, tense gathering of only the most necessary guests, and an atmosphere that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. Elira stood at the altar in a simple gown of pale blue silk, a gift from the Duke that had arrived without explanation 2 days earlier. It was the finest thing she had ever worn, yet it felt heavier than any servant's uniform she had ever put on. Her hands trembled as she held a small bundle of white flowers, and she kept her eyes fixed on the stone floor, afraid to look up and see the disapproval she knew was waiting for her. Duke Alaric stood beside her, tall and composed, though she noticed the way his jaw tightened whenever someone in the small crowd whispered too loudly. His mother, Duchess Margaret, sat in the front row, her back rigid, her face carved from ice. She had not spoken a single word to Elira since arriving, and she made no attempt to hide her disapproval now. Every time Elira glanced her way, the older woman's eyes burned with a mixture of anger and something else, something that looked almost like fear. The priest spoke the traditional words, his voice echoing softly through the chapel. Elira barely heard them. Her mind was a storm of questions that had gone unanswered for over 2 weeks. Why had the Duke chosen her? What danger had he spoken of? Why did his mother look at her as though she were a ghost from the past rather than a simple servant girl? When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, a strange silence fell over the chapel. There was no applause, no joyful shouting. Only the sound of wind pressing against the old stone walls and the quiet, watchful eyes of nobles who still could not believe what they were witnessing. Duke Alaric took her hand as they walked back down the aisle together, his grip firm but gentle, as though he were trying to steady her without drawing attention to it. Elira glanced up at him and caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite understand. It was not love. It was too early, too strange a situation for anything like love. But it was something close to determination, as if he had made a promise to himself and intended to keep it no matter what stood in his way. That evening, Elira was moved into her new chambers in the east wing of the manor, a suite of rooms larger than the entire servant quarters she had once shared with a dozen other girls. The furniture was carved from dark polished wood, the windows draped with heavy curtains embroidered in silver thread, and a fire crackled softly in a marble fireplace. It should have felt like a dream come true. Instead, it felt like a cage dressed up to look like a palace. A young maid named Clara arrived shortly after to help her settle in. Clara had been one of the few servants who had ever treated Elira kindly during her years of scrubbing floors, and now, oddly, their positions had shifted so dramatically that Clara had to remind herself to address her properly. "Your Grace," Clara said carefully, testing the unfamiliar title on her tongue as she folded linens into a wooden chest. "Please," Elira said, managing a tired smile. "Just call me Elira, at least when we are alone." Clara glanced nervously toward the door before lowering her voice. "The other servants are saying terrible things. They say you must have bewitched the Duke somehow. They say you'll be sent back to the kitchens within a month once he grows tired of you." Elira sank onto the edge of the large bed, suddenly feeling every bit as exhausted as she looked. "I don't understand any of this myself, Clara. One day I was scrubbing his floors, and the next I am his wife. He has told me nothing except that I am not safe and that I need his protection. What kind of marriage begins with a warning instead of a promise?" Clara sat down beside her, forgetting for a moment the strict rules about how a maid should behave around a duchess. "Maybe he truly cares for you," she said gently. "Maybe he simply doesn't know how to say it." "Or maybe," Elira murmured, staring at the fire, "there is something about me that he knows and I don't." Over the following days, Elira tried to adjust to her new life, but every corner of the manor felt like a battlefield. The household staff, who had once laughed and gossiped with her in the kitchens, now either avoided her entirely or watched her with resentful, suspicious eyes. She overheard a cook mutter that some people didn't know their place, and a stable boy snicker that the Duke must have lost his mind. Each comment struck her like a small stone, chipping away at the little confidence she had left. Worse than the servants' whispers was the cold, unyielding presence of Duchess Margaret. The older woman had taken up residence in the manor's west wing, and she made her opinion of the marriage known through every glance, every clipped word, every meal eaten in stony silence. One afternoon, as Alira walked through the garden trying to clear her mind, Duchess Margaret intercepted her path, blocking the narrow stone walkway with her cane. "You think you have won something," the Duchess said, her voice low and sharp. "A title, a fortune. A grand house to call your own." "I never wanted any of this, Your Grace," Alira replied honestly. "I did not ask to be chosen." The Duchess studied her for a long moment, and for the briefest instant, something flickered across her weathered face, something that looked almost like recognition or perhaps dread. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced once more by icy disdain. "My son is not a foolish man," the Duchess said. "Whatever reason he has for this marriage, it is not affection. Do not mistake his actions for love, girl. And do not think for one moment that this family will simply accept you, because he has placed a ring on your finger." With that, she turned and walked away, her cane tapping sharply against the stone path, leaving Alira standing alone among the roses, more confused and unsettled than ever. That evening, Duke Alaric requested her presence in his private study, a room Alira had never entered before. It was filled with tall shelves of books, a large desk covered in papers, and a single window overlooking the dark gardens below. He stood near the fireplace when she entered, his expression unusually thoughtful. "You spoke with my mother today," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Word travels quickly in this house," Alira replied carefully. "It always has," he said, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "I owe you an explanation, Alira, more than I have given you so far, but the timing must be right. If I tell you everything now before certain matters are settled, it could put you in greater danger than you already face." "Your Grace," Alira said, frustration finally breaking through her careful, servant-trained politeness. "How am I supposed to live in this house, married to a man I barely know, hated by his mother, mocked by his servants, when I don't even understand why any of this is happening?" Duke Alaric crossed the room slowly and stood before her, closer than he had ever stood before. Up close, she could see flecks of silver in his gray eyes, and the faint shadow of worry lines that had not been there, perhaps, before her arrival in his life. "I know this is difficult," he said quietly. "I know I am asking you to trust a stranger with your entire life, but I promise you, Alira, everything I am doing to protect you. There are people in this court who would see you harmed if they discovered certain things about your past. Marrying you was the fastest way to place you under my protection, where they cannot easily reach you." "What things?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What could a servant possibly have in her past that anyone would care about? He studied her face for a long moment, as though weighing how much he dared to reveal. Finally, his eyes drifted downward, toward the small chain visible at her collar, the one that disappeared beneath her gown to the tarnished locket she always kept close to her heart. "That locket you wear," he said softly, "where did you get it?" Alira's hand instinctively rose to touch the metal through the fabric of her dress. "I've had it since I was a small child. The orphanage matron said it was pinned to my blanket the night I was left at their doorstep. I don't know who it belonged to before me." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a mixture of confirmation and sorrow that he quickly tried to hide. "Keep it safe," he said. "Never let anyone take it from you. Not the servants, not my mother, not anyone in this court. Do you understand?" "Your Grace, you're frightening me." "Good," he said, and though the words sounded harsh, his eyes held something gentler, something almost apologetic. "Fear will keep you cautious. And in this house, right now, caution is the only thing that might keep you alive." Before she could ask another question, a servant knocked at the door, announcing that dinner was ready and that several guests, including members of the royal court, had arrived unexpectedly to see the Duke's new bride for themselves. Duke Alaric's face hardened instantly, the vulnerable man from a moment ago disappearing behind his familiar cold mask. "Stay close to me tonight," he murmured as they walked toward the door together. "And whatever happens, whatever anyone says to provoke you, do not remove that locket from around your neck." Alira nodded, though her heart pounded with a fear she could not fully name. As they walked down the long corridor toward the dining hall, she could hear the murmur of unfamiliar voices growing louder, and somewhere among them, she thought she recognized the sharp, cutting tone of Lady Seraphina, who had clearly not given up so easily on the life she believed should have been hers. The dining hall glowed with candlelight when Alira entered on the Duke's arm, and every head at the long table turned toward her at once. She recognized several faces from court, powerful men and women who had likely never spoken a single word to a servant in their entire lives, now studying her as though she were an exotic animal placed on display for their amusement. At the head of the table sat Lady Seraphina, seated in a position of honor that Alira suspected had not been assigned to her by accident. Beside her sat her father, Lord Bramwell, a heavy-set man with cold, calculating eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. Further down the table sat two royal advisors, sent, Alira guessed, to report back to the crown about the Duke's controversial choice of bride. "Ah, here she is," Lord Bramwell said, rising slightly as Alira and the Duke took their seats. "The woman who has captured our Duke's heart so completely that he abandoned centuries of tradition for her." The words were polite on the surface, but Alira could hear the mockery buried beneath them, sharp as a hidden blade. "Lord Bramwell," Duke Alaric replied evenly, "I trust you did not travel all this way simply to comment on my marriage." "Of course not," Lord Bramwell said smoothly. "We came to celebrate it naturally, though I confess we are all rather curious about your bride's family. Ashworth is one of the oldest names in the kingdom. Surely there is some noble blood somewhere in her lineage, even distant, that convinced you she was a suitable match." Every eye at the table turned to Alira, waiting for her answer. She felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm, remembering the years of training that had taught her to hold her composure no matter how frightening the situation. "I was raised in an orphanage, Lord Bramwell," she said clearly, refusing to let her voice shake. "I have no knowledge of noble blood in my family. I was a servant in this house before I became the Duke's wife, and I see no reason to pretend otherwise." A ripple of surprise passed through the table. Clearly, they had expected her to lie, to invent some fictional noble ancestor to make herself seem worthy of the title she now carried. Her honesty seemed to unsettle them more than any lie could have. "How refreshingly humble," Lady Seraphina said, though her tone suggested the opposite of admiration. "Tell me, Alira, do you even know which fork to use for the fish course? Or shall we send for simpler utensils, given your background?" Several nobles chuckled quietly at this. Alira felt heat rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, she noticed the delicate silverware arranged before her plate, remembered watching countless formal dinners from the shadows of the kitchen doorway over the years, memorizing every detail out of simple curiosity. Without hesitation, she picked up the correct fork and used it properly as the first course arrived. Lady Seraphina's smile faltered slightly. "A lucky guess," she said dismissively, though her eyes had narrowed with something closer to suspicion than triumph. Throughout the meal, the nobles continued their quiet campaign of humiliation, asking Alira questions designed to expose her lack of noble education, expecting her to stumble over unfamiliar customs or foreign phrases. But strangely, again and again, Alira answered correctly. When one of the royal advisors mentioned a piece of classical poetry in an obscure old language, Alira quietly finished the verse he had begun, surprising even herself with how easily the words came to her lips. "How curious," the advisor said, studying her with new interest. "Not many outside the Royal Academy study the old poets these days. Where did you learn such things if you were only a servant?" Alira paused, genuinely searching her own memory for an answer. I'm not entirely certain, she admitted slowly. Sometimes I simply know things, as though I learned them long ago and forgot when or where. The table fell into an uncomfortable silence. Duke Alaric's hand found hers beneath the table, squeezing gently, a silent signal for her to say no more. But it was too late. The seed of curiosity had already been planted among the guests, and Alira could see calculations forming behind several pairs of watchful eyes. Lord Bramwell leaned forward, his heavy features sharpening with interest. Perhaps our new Duchess has hidden depths none of us anticipated, he said slowly. Tell me, my dear, do you recall anything at all from before your time at the orphanage? Any memories, however small? Alira hesitated. She had never spoken of the strange, fragmented images that sometimes visited her in dreams, images of a burning building, a woman's frantic voice, the feeling of being carried through darkness by someone running as fast as their legs would allow. She had always dismissed them as nightmares, meaningless products of an overactive imagination. Nothing of importance, she said carefully. Only dreams, and dreams mean little. Dreams can mean a great deal, Lord Bramwell said softly, to those who know how to interpret them. Duke Alaric's grip on her hand tightened further, and this time his voice cut sharply across the table. I believe we have wandered far from pleasant dinner conversation, Lord Bramwell. Perhaps we should discuss something less personal. Lord Bramwell inclined his head in false apology, but Alira noticed the way his eyes lingered on her throat, where the outline of her locket's chain was faintly visible above the neckline of her gown. A chill ran through her, and she instinctively reached up to make sure the pendant remained hidden beneath the fabric. The rest of dinner passed with strained politeness, but the tension in the room never fully faded. When the guests finally departed late into the evening, Alira felt as though she had survived a battle rather than a meal. You did well tonight, Duke Alaric told her once they were alone in the quiet corridor outside the dining hall. Better than well. You handled their tests with more grace than most nobles born to the title could have managed. They weren't testing my manners, Alira said quietly. They were testing something else, trying to find cracks, trying to prove I don't belong here. And yet you gave them nothing to use against you, he said, though his expression remained troubled. Except perhaps the mention of your dreams. You noticed that too. I notice everything about tonight, he said. Lord Bramwell is not a man who asks idle questions. If he is curious about your past, it means someone has already begun to suspect something. Suspect what exactly? Alira demanded, her patience finally wearing thin after weeks of half-answers and cryptic warnings. You keep speaking in riddles, Your Grace. If there is real danger here, danger that involves men like Lord Bramwell, then I deserve to know what it is. Duke Alaric glanced down the empty corridor, checking that no servants lingered within earshot, before lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. There was a noble family, he said slowly, many years ago that the crown considered too powerful, too influential, and ultimately too dangerous to allow to continue. Their estate burned to the ground one night, and it was reported that every member of the family died in the fire. But rumors persisted for years afterward that a single child had survived, smuggled away before the flames consumed the manor, hidden somewhere far from court where no one would think to look. Alira's breath caught in her throat. The images from her dreams, the burning building, the desperate voice, the feeling of being carried through darkness, suddenly felt less like nightmares and more like memories struggling to surface after years of being buried. You think, she whispered, hardly able to form the words, that I might be that child. I don't merely think it, Duke Alaric said quietly. I have suspected it since the very first time I saw you years ago, when you first arrived at this manor as a frightened 16-year-old girl. There was something familiar in your face, something I could not place at the time. It was only recently, after months of quiet investigation, that I found enough evidence to be certain. What evidence? Alira asked, her voice trembling. Your locket, he said. The crest engraved inside it matches records from an old noble house. records that were supposed to have been destroyed along with everyone who bore that name. Alira's hand flew to her chest, feeling the small, tarnished shape of the locket beneath her gown. She had looked at that crest 1,000 times over the years, tracing its worn edges with her fingertip, never once suspecting it held the key to an entire hidden identity. "If this is true," she said slowly, piecing together the puzzle even as fear coiled tightly in her stomach, "then Lord Bramwell's questions tonight weren't idle curiosity at all." "No," Duke Alaric agreed grimly. "I believe he suspects something as well. And if he confirms his suspicions before we are ready to reveal the truth ourselves, on our own terms, with proof and protection in place, then your life will be in far greater danger than it already is." "Why?" Alira asked, though some part of her already feared the answer. "If I truly am this lost child, why would anyone still care after all these years? Why would anyone want to hurt me over events from so long ago?" Duke Alaric's jaw tightened, and for a moment the mask of calm control slipped entirely, revealing something rower underneath, something that looked almost like guilt. "Because," he said quietly, "if you are who I believe you are, then you are not merely the daughter of a forgotten noble house. You are the rightful heir to lands, titles, and a claim that certain powerful men in this kingdom worked very hard and did very terrible things to erase forever. And men like that do not enjoy discovering that their past crimes have come back to threaten everything they built upon them." The weight of his words settled over Alira like a physical force, pressing the air from her lungs. She thought of Duchess Margaret's strange, fearful glances, of the Duke's insistence that she never remove her locket, of Lord Bramwell's calculating eyes lingering on her throat during dinner. Every strange, unexplained moment since her sudden marriage suddenly began arranging itself into a terrifying, coherent picture. "Then everyone at that dinner tonight," she said slowly, "everyone who watched me, questioned me, tested me, they might have been searching for exactly this." "Yes," Duke Alaric said, "which is why, starting tomorrow, I need you to trust me completely, even when my actions seem strange or my explanations feel incomplete. There are still pieces of this puzzle I have not shared with you, pieces I am still working to confirm. But I promise you, Alira, I will not let anyone in this court harm you, whatever your true name may turn out to be." Alira stood in the quiet corridor, the candlelight flickering against the stone walls, and for the first time since her sudden, bewildering marriage, she felt something shift inside her chest. It was not quite trust, not yet, not fully. But it was the beginning of understanding, the first thread connecting the frightened servant girl she had always believed herself to be with the mysterious, dangerous truth that now seemed to be unraveling around her with every passing day. "Tomorrow," she said finally, "you will tell me everything you know. No more half-answers, Your Grace. If my life is truly in danger, I deserve to understand why." Duke Alaric held her gaze for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she had known him, something close to a genuine smile touched his lips. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "Everything." But as they parted ways for the night, each retreating to their separate chambers, neither of them noticed the shadow lingering near the far end of the corridor, nor the quiet, satisfied smile that crossed Lord Bramwell's face as he slipped silently back toward his guest quarters, already composing the letter he intended to send before sunrise to certain powerful allies who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this kind of news. Morning arrived with a heavy gray sky, and Alira woke feeling as though she had barely slept at all. Every time she had closed her eyes during the night, fragments of her strange dreams returned, sharper now than ever before, as though the conversation with Duke Alaric had unlocked something long buried in her mind. She saw flashes of a grand hallway lined with portraits, the smell of smoke curling beneath a heavy wooden door, and a woman's voice, desperate and trembling, whispering words she could not quite make out. Clara arrived shortly after dawn to help her dress, humming softly as she moved about the room, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing within Alira's mind. "You look tired, Your Grace," Clara said, studying her face with concern as she brushed out Alira's long hair. "I did not sleep well," Alira admitted. She hesitated, then added carefully, "Clara, has anyone asked you strange questions about me recently? Questions about my past, or where I came from?" Clara's hands paused mid-brush stroke, and in the mirror's reflection, Alira caught a flicker of unease crossing the young maid's face. "Actually," Clara said slowly, "one of the visiting servants, a woman who arrived with Lord Bramwell's party, did ask me some odd things yesterday evening. She wanted to know if I had ever seen you without your locket, or if I knew where you kept it when you bathed or slept." A cold feeling settled in Alira's stomach. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know," Clara said. "I thought it was simply idle gossip among the servants, the kind that always follows something so unusual as your marriage. I did not think much of it until now, seeing your face." Alira reached up instinctively to touch the small chain at her throat, relief washing through her, as her fingers found the familiar shape of the locket still resting safely beneath her nightgown. "Clara," she said carefully, "I need you to help me with something, and I need you to trust me completely, even if I cannot fully explain why it matters." Clara nodded immediately, her loyalty evident in her steady gaze. "Of course, Your Grace, whatever you need. If anyone, servant or noble, ever asks to see this locket, or tries to touch it while I am not aware, I need you to alert me immediately, no matter what excuse they give." "I promise," Clara said solemnly. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the chamber door. Clara moved to answer it, revealing a young serving woman Alira did not recognize, dressed in unfamiliar livery that marked her as part of Lord Bramwell's traveling household staff. "Pardon the intrusion," the woman said with a polite curtsy, though her eyes moved quickly around the room, taking in every detail with unusual sharpness. "Lady Seraphina requested that I deliver a message to the Duchess personally. She wishes to invite you for tea this morning, as a gesture of goodwill following last night's dinner." Alira exchanged a quick glance with Clara, before responding carefully. "Please tell Lady Seraphina I would be honored to join her." The serving woman nodded and turned to leave, but as she did, her gaze lingered for just a moment too long on Alira's throat, on the thin silver chain barely visible above her collar. It was a small thing, a fraction of a second, but Alira noticed it, and a chill ran down her spine. After the woman departed, Clara closed the door and turned to Alira with wide, frightened eyes. "Your Grace, I don't trust that invitation, not after everything you've just told me." "Neither do I," Alira admitted. "But if I refuse, it will only raise more suspicion. Better to attend, stay alert, and reveal nothing." An hour later, Alira made her way to the manor's smaller sitting room, where Lady Seraphina waited beside a delicate table set with fine porcelain cups and a steaming pot of tea. The noblewoman's smile was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold hostility she had shown the previous evening, and that contrast alone put Alira immediately on guard. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior at dinner," Lady Seraphina said as Alira took her seat. "I confess, the shock of the Duke's decision affected me more deeply than I care to admit. I hope we might start again, as friends rather than rivals." "Of course," Alira replied carefully, accepting the cup of tea offered to her but not yet drinking from it. "I understand this has been difficult for everyone." They spoke for several minutes about trivial matters, the weather, the upcoming season, the manor's beautiful gardens, and slowly Alira began to relax slightly, wondering if perhaps she had misjudged the situation entirely. But then Lady Seraphina reached across the table, as though to adjust a stray strand of hair near Alira's face, and her fingers brushed deliberately against the chain at Alira's neck. "What a curious little pendant," Lady Seraphina said, her voice suddenly sharper, her fingers already tugging gently at the chain, attempting to draw it free from beneath the fabric of Alira's gown. "May I see it more closely? I do love examining unusual jewelry." Alira's heart pounded as she instinctively pulled back, her hand flying up to catch the chain and press it protectively against her chest. "It was a gift," she said quickly, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the panic rising within her. "A private one. I would rather keep it hidden if you don't mind." Lady Seraphina's eyes narrowed, the false warmth in her expression evaporating instantly. "How strange," she said coldly, "for a simple servant to guard a piece of jewelry so fiercely. One might almost think it holds some special significance." Before Alira could respond, the sitting room door burst open and Duke Alaric strode in, his expression darker than Alira had ever seen it. He crossed the room in a few swift strides and placed himself firmly between Alira and Lady Seraphina, his presence radiating a controlled fury that seemed to fill the entire space. "Lady Seraphina," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "I trust you have a good explanation for attempting to remove something from my wife's person without her consent." Lady Seraphina rose quickly from her chair, her composure cracking slightly under the weight of his glare. "Your Grace, I meant no harm. I was simply curious about her pendant, nothing more." "You will leave this room immediately," Duke Alaric said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you will not approach my wife again without my direct permission. Is that understood?" Lady Seraphina's face flushed with anger and humiliation, but she offered a stiff curtsy before storming from the room, leaving her tea untouched and her composure thoroughly shattered. Once the door closed behind her, Duke Alaric turned to Alira, his expression softening slightly as he studied her pale, shaken face. "Are you harmed?" "No," Alira said, though her hands still trembled slightly as she released her grip on the chain. "But she knew exactly what she was looking for, Your Grace. This wasn't idle curiosity. Someone told her about the locket." "I know," Duke Alaric said grimly, "which confirms my worst fear. Lord Bramwell suspects something, and he is using every resource available to him to confirm it, including Lady Seraphina's jealousy and ambition." Alira studied him carefully, remembering his promise from the previous night. "You said you would tell me everything today. I think that time has come rather urgently, Your Grace." Duke Alaric nodded slowly, glancing toward the door to ensure it remained closed before speaking. "Come with me. There is something in my private study I need to show you, something I have kept hidden even from my own household staff." He led her through a series of quiet corridors, away from the more populated areas of the manor, until they reached a heavy wooden door secured with an iron lock. Duke Alaric produced a small key from beneath his coat and unlocked it, revealing a narrow room filled with shelves of old documents, portraits covered in protective cloth, and a single large trunk positioned in the center of the floor. "This room belonged to my father," he explained as he closed the door firmly behind them. "He spent years collecting information about a certain noble family that vanished under suspicious circumstances. I found this room and everything within it shortly after his death." He knelt beside the trunk and carefully opened its heavy lid, revealing stacks of yellowed letters, old maps, and a large leather-bound book that looked ancient even from a distance. "This is the family record of House Veyron," he said, lifting the book gently and setting it upon a nearby table. "A noble house that once held significant power and influence in this kingdom, until they were accused of treason 20 years ago, and their entire estate was burned to the ground in a single terrible night." Alira approached the table slowly, her eyes drawn to a faded portrait tucked among the papers, depicting a beautiful young woman with dark hair and striking eyes, standing beside a small child who could not have been more than a few years old. "That woman," Duke Alaric said quietly, following her gaze, "was Lady Isolde Veyron, the last confirmed head of the family before the fire. And that child beside her was her daughter, believed to have died alongside her mother that night." Alira stared at the portrait, an unsettling familiarity tugging at the edges of her memory. Something about the shape of the child's eyes, the particular tilt of her small chin, felt intimately, impossibly familiar, as though she were looking into a mirror reflecting a version of herself from long ago. "You believe that child is me," she said slowly. "I believe it strongly," Duke Alaric said. "And this book contains a detailed description of the family crest, the very same crest engraved inside your locket. I compared them myself months ago, when I first began to suspect the truth." He turned several pages of the ancient book, until he reached an illustration of an ornate crest, featuring a pair of intertwined swans surrounding a small crown. Alira's breath caught as she recognized the design immediately, having traced its faded lines with her fingertip countless times over the years without ever understanding its true significance. "It's identical," she whispered. "Yes," Duke Alaric said softly. "Which means, Alira, that if my suspicions are correct, you are not merely a lost orphan raised by chance in a distant orphanage. You are Alira Veyron, the rightful heir to one of the most powerful noble houses this kingdom has ever known, a house that certain men in this court worked very hard and committed terrible crimes to erase entirely from history." Alira sank slowly into a nearby chair, her mind struggling to reconcile the frightened servant girl she had always believed herself to be with the extraordinary, dangerous truth now unfolding before her. 20 years of assumptions about her own identity crumbled away in the span of a single conversation, replaced by a mystery so vast and so perilous that she hardly knew where to begin untangling it. "If this is true," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "then everyone who orchestrated that fire, everyone responsible for destroying my family, they are still out there. And now that Lord Bramwell suspects who I might be, they will know I survived." "Yes," Duke Alaric said grimly, kneeling before her chair and taking both her trembling hands in his own. "Which is why I need you to be stronger now than you have ever been in your entire life, Alira. Because the moment the truth becomes undeniable, this court will divide itself into those who wish to protect you, and those who will stop at nothing to ensure you never claim what is rightfully yours." That night sleep refused to come easily, and when it finally did, Alira found herself pulled into the deepest, most vivid dream she had ever experienced. Unlike her usual fragmented nightmares, this one unfolded with startling clarity, as though a door long sealed within her mind had finally creaked open. She saw a grand estate, its halls lined with tall windows and portraits of solemn, dark-haired ancestors. She saw a woman with kind eyes and dark hair, the same woman from the portrait in Duke Alaric's study, kneeling before her, and fastening a small silver locket around her neck with trembling fingers. "Wear this always," the woman whispered in the dream, her voice thick with fear. "No matter what happens tonight, my darling girl, never let anyone take this from you." Then came chaos. Shouting voices echoed through distant corridors, followed by the sharp, acrid smell of smoke curling beneath heavy wooden doors. The woman scooped the small child into her arms and ran, her silk skirts whipping against stone walls as she hurried down a narrow servant staircase that Alira somehow knew, even in the dream, led away from the main house. At the bottom of the stairs waited an older servant woman, her face lined with worry, holding open a hidden door that led into the darkness of the surrounding forest. "Take her," Lady Isolde said, pressing the small child into the servant's arms. "Take her far from here and never speak of where she came from. Raise her as your own if you must, but keep her safe. Promise me." "My lady, please, come with us," the servant woman begged, tears streaming down her weathered face. "There is no time," Lady Isolde said, glancing fearfully over her shoulder as the sound of shouting grew louder, closer. "They are already here for me. If they find her too, everything I have tried to protect will be for nothing. Go now before it is too late." The servant woman nodded through her tears, clutching the small child tightly against her chest as she disappeared into the darkness of the trees. The last thing Alira saw in the dream, before it dissolved into swirling darkness, was Lady Isolde's face illuminated by the growing glow of firelight, her expression a mixture of terror and fierce, unwavering love, as she turned back toward the burning manor to face whatever waited for her there. Alira woke with a violent gasp, her entire body trembling, tears streaming down her face before she even fully understood why she was crying. The dream had felt less like imagination and more like memory, as though her mind had finally allowed a locked door to swing open after 20 years of careful, protective silence. She rose from her bed and moved to the window, staring out at the dark gardens below as she tried to steady her breathing. The details of the dream remained vivid in her mind, the smell of smoke, the sound of Lady Isolde's desperate voice, the rough hands of the servant woman carrying her through the forest. It felt too specific, too real, to be nothing more than a nightmare invented by an anxious mind. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Duke Alaric standing in the corridor, still dressed despite the late hour, his expression concerned. "I heard you cry out," he said. "May I come in?" She nodded, stepping aside to let him enter, and quickly recounted the dream in as much detail as she could remember, her voice shaking as she described the burning manor, the desperate mother, the loyal servant who had carried her to safety. Duke Alaric listened silently, his face growing paler with each detail she shared, until finally he moved to the trunk of documents he had shown her earlier, which he had brought to her chambers for safekeeping after their conversation. He searched through the papers until he found a specific letter, yellowed with age, and handed it to her carefully. "Read this," he said quietly. "It was written by my father, shortly after the fire, based on testimony he gathered from villagers who lived near the Veyron estate." Alira's hands trembled as she unfolded the fragile paper and began to read. The letter described eyewitness accounts from villagers who had seen a woman running from the burning manor through a hidden servant's passage, carrying a small child, before disappearing into the surrounding forest. It described how the woman was never seen again, presumed to have died somewhere in the wilderness while fleeing, though no body was ever found. It described rumors, persistent for years afterward, that a mysterious woman matching that description had appeared several years later at the doorstep of a distant orphanage, leaving behind a small girl with instructions that she never be told the truth of her origins, before vanishing entirely from any historical record. "The orphanage," Alira whispered, her eyes wide with dawning realization. "The matron who raised me, she once told me a strange woman brought me to their doorstep in the middle of the night, feverish and exhausted, and made her promise never to reveal how I came to be there. The matron always assumed the woman was simply a frightened, unmarried mother trying to protect her reputation." "But you believe now it was the very servant from your dream," Duke Alaric said softly. "The one who carried you away from the fire that night." "It has to be," Alira said, tears filling her eyes once more. "Everything matches. The locket, the fire, the flight through the forest, even the fever the matron mentioned, likely from exhaustion after carrying a child for so many miles through dangerous wilderness." Duke Alaric sat down beside her, his expression thoughtful. "My father spent years trying to confirm these rumors, but he died before he could complete his investigation. When I inherited this trunk and everything within it, I continued his work quietly, never truly believing I would find the answers he sought, until I met you 3 years ago, scrubbing floors in this very manor." "You said you noticed something familiar about me even then," Alira said, remembering his earlier confession. "I did," he admitted. "Something in your eyes reminded me instantly of the portrait my father kept hidden in this trunk, but I dismissed it at first as simple coincidence. It was only after watching you for years, noticing small things, the way you sometimes hummed a particular tune you claimed not to remember learning, the way you occasionally used words and phrases far too sophisticated for someone raised in an orphanage, that my suspicions grew too strong to ignore." "So you investigated me," Alira said, not accusingly but with quiet understanding. "I did," he confirmed, "carefully, secretly over the course of many months. I traced records from the orphanage, spoke discreetly with elderly villagers who remembered the night of the fire, and eventually confirmed enough evidence to convince myself of the truth, even before I saw the crest inside your locket with my own eyes. And once you were certain," Alira said slowly, piecing together the final missing part of the puzzle, "you decided the safest way to protect me, and to protect the truth until you were ready to reveal it, was to marry me yourself, placing me under the full protection of your title before anyone else could discover what you had learned." "Yes," Duke Alaric said simply. "I know it must feel as though I manipulated you into a marriage without your full understanding or consent, and for that I am truly sorry. But I feared that if I approached you with the truth before securing your safety, before you carried the protection of my name and my house, you would have been in far greater danger than you already were." Alira studied his face carefully in the dim candlelight, searching for any sign of deception, but finding only exhaustion and genuine remorse. "I forgive you," she said finally, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "You did what you believed necessary to protect an innocent stranger, at great risk to your own reputation and standing in this court. That is not the action of a cruel man, Your Grace." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes that made him suddenly look less like the cold, unreadable duke the entire court feared, and more like a man carrying an enormous burden he had finally been able to share. "There is one more thing you should know," he said quietly. "The rumors surrounding the destruction of House Veyron suggest it was not a simple accident, nor even a spontaneous act of mob violence as the official records claim. My father believed, and I have since found evidence supporting his belief, that the fire was deliberately set, orchestrated by powerful men within the court who viewed the Veyron family's growing influence as a direct threat to their own ambitions." "Lord Bramwell," Alira said immediately, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "That's why he asked such pointed questions at dinner. That's why his servant searched for information about my locket. I believe Lord Bramwell's family may have played a significant role in orchestrating the destruction of House Veyron," Duke Alaric confirmed grimly, "though I have not yet found direct proof strong enough to bring formal accusations before the crown. If he suspects you are the missing Veyron heir, and if he fears you might one day seek justice or reclaim your family's lost lands and titles, he will see you not merely as an inconvenience, but as a genuine threat to everything his family has built over the past 20 years. Then he will try to silence me," Alira said quietly, the full weight of her danger finally settling over her with complete clarity. "Before I ever have the chance to discover the truth myself, or worse, before I have the chance to seek justice for what happened to my mother." "Which is precisely why we must move carefully," Duke Alaric said, "gathering enough undeniable proof to protect you legally and publicly, before Lord Bramwell or anyone allied with him realizes just how much we already know." Alira looked down at the ancient letter still clutched in her trembling hands, then at the faded portrait of the mother she barely remembered, the woman whose final act of desperate love had been to send her only child running into the darkness, rather than surrender her to men who valued power more than innocent life. "I want justice," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. "Not merely for myself, Your Grace, but for my mother, and for everyone else who died in that fire simply because they stood in the way of men too ambitious and too cruel to allow anyone to threaten their position." Duke Alaric nodded slowly, respect evident in his gray eyes as he studied the newfound determination hardening her delicate features. "Then we shall find it together," he said. "But we must be patient, and above all, we must be careful. Lord Bramwell has powerful allies throughout this court, and if he discovers the extent of what we know before we are ready, he will not hesitate to eliminate the threat you represent by whatever means necessary." Outside, the wind picked up suddenly, rattling the tall windows of Alira's chamber, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the late hour across the sleeping estate. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet, candle-lit moment of shared purpose and fragile trust, that a single set of footsteps had paused just outside the chamber door minutes earlier, listening carefully to every word before retreating silently back into the shadows of the manor's ancient corridors. 3 days later, the peaceful calm Alira had begun to build within the manor shattered completely, when a formal summons arrived from the royal court, demanding that the Duke and his new wife appear before a tribunal to answer serious accusations that had been brought against her. Alira read the summons with trembling hands, her eyes catching immediately on the specific charges listed in careful, official script. She was accused of practicing forbidden magic to manipulate the Duke's affections, of stealing valuable jewelry belonging to a noble family, and of deliberately concealing her true identity in order to deceive the entire court for personal gain. "This is Lady Seraphina's doing," Alira said, her voice tight with anger and fear as she handed the summons to Duke Alaric. She must have convinced her father to bring these accusations before the tribunal. Duke Alaric's expression darkened as he read through the document, his jaw tightening with barely controlled fury. "This bears Lord Bramwell's influence throughout every line," he said. "He is forcing the truth into the open before we are ready, hoping to control how it is revealed and used against you." "What happens if I cannot prove these accusations false?" Alira asked, fear creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. "The punishment for practicing forbidden magic is severe," Duke Alaric said grimly, "though we both know that particular accusation is baseless and easily disproven. The charge of theft is more concerning, since it directly relates to your locket, and Lord Bramwell likely intends to use the tribunal as an opportunity to force its examination and confirm his suspicions publicly, on his own terms rather than ours." "Then we must be the ones to reveal the truth first," Alira said, steadying her resolve despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "Better to control how the truth emerges than to let Lord Bramwell twist it into something that serves his own purposes." Duke Alaric studied her for a long moment, clear pride shining through his concern. "Are you certain you are ready for this? Once the truth becomes public, there will be no returning to the quiet life you once knew, however difficult that life may have been." "I have never truly had a quiet life to return to, Your Grace," Alira said honestly. "I have only had uncertainty, questions, and fear. Perhaps it is time I finally learned who I truly am in front of the entire court, rather than hiding from a truth that clearly refuses to remain buried any longer." The tribunal was scheduled to take place 3 days later, in the grand hall of the royal palace itself, before a panel of judges appointed by the crown and observed by dozens of curious nobles eager to witness the scandal unfolding before them. Duke Alaric spent every spare moment of those 3 days gathering evidence, consulting with trusted allies, and preparing Alira for the difficult questions she would undoubtedly face. Among the allies Duke Alaric brought into their confidence was an elderly court historian named Edmund Blackwood, a quiet, scholarly man who had spent decades studying the noble families of the kingdom and their complicated, often tragic histories. When Duke Alaric explained the situation and showed him the ancient book from his father's trunk, along with a careful sketch of the crest inside Alira's locket, the old historian's eyes widened with genuine astonishment. "I remember House Varon well," Edmund said, his voice hushed with the weight of old memories. "I was a young apprentice historian when the fire occurred, and I always suspected the official explanation offered by the crown was incomplete, if not entirely false. If this young woman truly carries the Varon crest, and if her story matches the historical records as closely as you describe, then this could be the single most significant discovery in this kingdom's recent history." "Will you testify to what you know at the tribunal?" Duke Alaric asked. Edmund hesitated only briefly before nodding firmly. "I have spent my entire career seeking truth in dusty old records nobody else cared to examine. I will not remain silent now, when that truth finally has the chance to walk into a courtroom and speak for itself." On the morning of the tribunal, Alira dressed carefully in a gown of deep emerald green, chosen deliberately by Duke Alaric to complement the pale silver of her locket, which she now wore openly for the first time, resting visibly against her collarbone rather than hidden beneath her clothing. If Lord Bramwell intended to expose her secret before the entire court, she decided she would meet that exposure with quiet dignity rather than fearful concealment. The grand hall of the royal palace was packed with spectators when they arrived, far more than Alira had anticipated, and she felt every curious gaze settle upon her as she walked beside Duke Alaric toward the raised platform where 3 stern-faced judges awaited their arrival. Lord Bramwell sat prominently among the observers, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth, while Lady Seraphina sat beside him, her expression a mixture of triumph and barely concealed nervousness. The chief judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, called the tribunal to order and read aloud the formal accusations against Alira. The hall fell into tense silence as the charges echoed through the vast space, each word landing like a physical blow against Alira's carefully maintained composure. "How does the accused respond to these charges?" the chief judge asked, turning her sharp gaze directly toward Alira. Alira stepped forward, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I deny the charges of forbidden magic entirely, as they are without any basis in truth. As for the charge of theft, I can only say that the item in question, this locket," she reached up and touched the pendant resting against her chest, "has belonged to me since I was a small child. Far from stealing it, I believe it may prove that I am the rightful, long-lost heir of a noble house believed destroyed 20 years ago." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the assembled crowd. Lord Bramwell's satisfied smile flickered, replaced momentarily by something sharper, more calculating, as he clearly recognized that Alira intended to seize control of the narrative rather than simply defend herself against his carefully constructed accusations. "A bold claim," the chief judge said, studying Alira carefully. "What evidence do you offer to support such an extraordinary assertion?" Duke Alaric stepped forward at this point, presenting the ancient book from his father's trunk, along with the historical letters documenting the fire and its aftermath, to the panel of judges for their examination. He explained clearly and methodically the years of investigation that had led him to his conclusions, careful to present every piece of evidence in a logical, undeniable sequence. When he finished, Edmund Blackwood was called forward to offer his expert testimony as a court historian, confirming the authenticity of the documents and the historical accuracy of the events they described. The old scholar spoke with quiet, unshakable confidence, and Alira watched as several of the judges leaned forward with increasing interest, clearly swayed by his careful, scholarly explanation. "I would like to examine the locket itself," the chief judge said finally, turning her attention back to Alira. "If the crest matches the historical records as claimed, it would provide compelling evidence in support of this remarkable claim." Alira removed the locket carefully and handed it forward, watching with held breath as the judges examined the delicate engraving under the bright light streaming through the tall windows of the grand hall. After several tense minutes of quiet consultation among themselves, the chief judge looked up, her expression carefully neutral despite the significance of what she was about to announce. "This crest matches historical records of House Veyron with remarkable precision," she declared, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Combined with the testimony and evidence presented today, this tribunal finds it plausible, if not yet definitively proven, that the accused may indeed be Alira Veyron, the long-lost heir of a noble house believed destroyed 2 decades ago." The hall erupted into chaotic murmuring, nobles turning to whisper urgently to one another as the full weight of this revelation settled over the assembled crowd. Lord Bramwell's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence replaced by something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating fury barely concealed beneath his rigid composure. "This is preposterous," Lord Bramwell said, rising from his seat with forced calm. "A tarnished old locket proves nothing. Anyone could have acquired such an item through theft or forgery. I demand further investigation before this tribunal grants any credibility to such an outlandish claim." "A reasonable request," the chief judge agreed, "and one this tribunal fully intends to honor. Further investigation will indeed be required before any formal recognition of inheritance or title can be granted. However," she continued, her sharp eyes settling directly on Lord Bramwell with an intensity that made him visibly flinch, "given the serious nature of these historical events, and the possibility that a genuine crime against a noble house may have occurred 20 years ago, this tribunal will also be launching a formal investigation into the true circumstances surrounding the destruction of House Veyron, including any individuals who may have played a role in orchestrating that tragedy." Lord Bramwell's expression cracked for just a moment, revealing genuine fear beneath his practiced composure, before he quickly regained control and offered a stiff, formal bow toward the panel of judges. "Of course," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. The Crown's pursuit of justice must always take precedence over personal concerns. As the tribunal concluded, and the assembled crowd began filing out of the grand hall, whispering excitedly among themselves about the extraordinary revelations they had just witnessed, Alira felt Duke Alaric's hand find hers, squeezing gently in silent reassurance. "You did wonderfully," he murmured as they made their way through the thinning crowd. "Better than I could have hoped." "It doesn't feel like a victory," Alira admitted quietly. "Lord Bramwell looked more dangerous walking out of that hall than he did walking into it." "You're right to be cautious," Duke Alaric agreed, his expression turning serious once more. "A cornered man is often the most dangerous of all. He knows now that his past crimes may finally be exposed, and men like him rarely surrender quietly when facing such consequences." As they exited the grand hall into the bright afternoon sunlight, Alira caught sight of Lady Seraphina standing alone near a stone pillar, her earlier triumphant expression replaced entirely by something that looked remarkably like fear as she watched her father's rigid, furious retreat toward his waiting carriage. For the briefest moment, their eyes met across the crowded courtyard, and Alira saw something unexpected flicker across Lady Seraphina's face, not hostility, but genuine uncertainty, as though the noblewoman was only now beginning to realize just how dangerous the game her father had been playing truly was, and wondering, perhaps for the first time, which side of that dangerous game she truly wished to stand upon. In the weeks following the tribunal, the formal investigation into House Varen's destruction moved forward with surprising speed, driven largely by public curiosity and the Crown's own interest in uncovering whether one of its most trusted noble families had truly been the victim of a deliberate conspiracy rather than a tragic accident. Duke Alaric worked tirelessly alongside Edmund Blackwood and a small team of trusted royal investigators, tracking down surviving witnesses from the night of the fire, examining old financial records that might reveal suspicious transactions among the nobles who had benefited most from House Varen's sudden downfall, and carefully documenting every piece of evidence that might strengthen Alira's claim to her family's lost inheritance. The most significant breakthrough came when investigators located an elderly woman living in a small village on the kingdom's northern border, a former servant of House Varen, who had survived the fire by fleeing through the same hidden passage used by Lady Isolde and her infant daughter. The woman, now well into her 70s and known simply as Old Marta by the villagers who had cared for her over the years, agreed to travel to the capital to provide testimony about what she remembered from that terrible night. Alira met Old Marta privately before her formal testimony, both women overwhelmed with emotion as the elderly servant studied Alira's face, with tears welling in her cloudy eyes. "You have your mother's eyes," Old Marta said softly, reaching out with trembling, weathered hands to gently touch Alira's cheek. "I helped raise Lady Isolde from a small child, and I would recognize those eyes anywhere, even after 20 long years." "Do you remember what happened that night?" Alira asked gently, though she already suspected the answer would confirm everything she had learned from her strange, fragmented dreams. "I remember everything," Old Marta said, her voice trembling with old grief. "Lord Bramwell arrived at the estate that evening with several armed men, claiming he needed to discuss urgent business with your grandfather regarding a trade dispute. But it was clearly a pretext. Within hours, fire had broken out simultaneously in 3 separate locations throughout the manor, far too coordinated to be accidental. Your mother realized immediately what was happening and rushed to save you, entrusting you to my care with her final instructions before returning to find your grandfather." "Did you see what happened to my mother?" Alira asked, her voice barely a whisper. Old Marta's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I did not stay to witness the end, child. Your mother made me promise to run, to protect you above all else, and I have carried that guilt for 20 years, wondering whether I should have stayed to help her instead. But I believe, based on what little I overheard as I fled through the forest, that Lord Bramwell's men ensured no one from your family survived the fire, except for you. This testimony, combined with the physical evidence already gathered, proved devastating to Lord Bramwell's position within the court. Additional witnesses came forward once old Marta's story became known, including a former guard who had worked for Lord Bramwell 20 years earlier and had long carried guilt over his forced silence regarding what he had witnessed that terrible night. As the investigation gathered irrefutable momentum, Duke Alaric finally sat down with Alira one quiet evening to share the complete truth he had uncovered over the previous months, filling in the final gaps that remained in her understanding of her own tragic history. "There is one thing I have not yet told you," he said carefully, as they sat together in his private study, the very room where he had first revealed the existence of House Veyron's hidden records. "Something about my own family's connection to yours, which I feared might complicate your trust in me if revealed too soon." Alira studied his troubled expression carefully. "Tell me," she said simply. "My father," Duke Alaric began slowly, "was a close friend and trusted advisor to your grandfather, the head of House Veyron, before the fire occurred. He suspected Lord Bramwell's involvement almost immediately, but lacked sufficient proof to bring formal accusations before the Crown, especially given Lord Bramwell's considerable influence and wealth at that time. My father spent the remainder of his life quietly gathering evidence, hoping eventually to expose the truth and see justice served, but he died before completing his investigation, leaving that unfinished responsibility to me." "So your father knew my grandfather personally," Alira said, absorbing this new layer of connection between their two families. "That explains why he kept such detailed records." "It explains more than that," Duke Alaric said quietly. "My father made a promise to your grandfather, shortly before the fire, that should anything ever happen to House Veyron, he would do everything within his power to protect any surviving members of the family. When he died without fulfilling that promise, I inherited it along with everything else in his estate, though I did not fully understand its significance until years later, when I began noticing certain similarities between you and the old portrait hidden within his private collection." "Then your decision to marry me," Alira said slowly, understanding dawning fully for the first time, "wasn't merely about protecting a stranger you suspected might be in danger. It was about honoring a promise your father made to my grandfather, decades before either of us was even born." "Yes," Duke Alaric admitted, "though I want you to understand something equally important, Alira. What began as duty, as an obligation inherited from my father, has become something far more genuine over these past weeks. I did not anticipate coming to care for you as deeply as I now do, watching your courage and resilience through everything this court has thrown against you." Alira felt warmth spreading through her chest despite the heaviness of their conversation, a warmth that had nothing to do with duty or inherited promises, and everything to do with the growing bond that had formed naturally between them through shared danger and mutual trust. "I have come to care for you as well," she admitted softly, "more than I expected to, given how strangely our marriage began." Their quiet moment was interrupted by an urgent knock at the study door. A royal messenger arrived carrying formal documentation from the tribunal, announcing that sufficient evidence had now been gathered to formally charge Lord Bramwell with treason and conspiracy in connection with the destruction of House Veyron 20 years earlier. Additionally, the documentation confirmed that Alira's claim to her family's identity had been formally recognized by the Crown, restoring to her the title, lands, and considerable fortune that had rightfully belonged to House Veyron before its tragic downfall. "It's official," Duke Alaric said, reading through the documentation with evident relief and satisfaction. "You are formally recognized as Alira Veyron, rightful heir to your family's estate and titles, and Lord Bramwell will finally face justice for the crimes he committed against your family." Alira felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over her. Relief and vindication tangled together with grief for the mother she barely remembered, and the family she had never truly known. 20 years of uncertainty, of feeling perpetually out of place in a world that never quite made sense to her, finally resolved into a clear, undeniable truth. "What happens now?" she asked, still trying to process the magnitude of everything that had unfolded over the past several weeks. "Now," Duke Alaric said, a genuine smile finally breaking through his usually composed expression, "you begin reclaiming everything that was stolen from you 20 years ago. Your family's estate will be restored, your title formally recognized throughout the kingdom, and Lord Bramwell will finally answer for the terrible crimes he committed against your family and against justice itself." But even as relief and hope filled the room, a shadow of concern remained in Duke Alaric's careful gaze. "There is still danger ahead, Alira. Lord Bramwell has powerful allies throughout this court, men who benefited from his conspiracy, and who may still wish to see this truth buried rather than exposed. We must remain vigilant even as we celebrate this victory." Alira nodded, understanding that her journey toward justice and toward fully claiming her true identity was far from finished. But for the first time since that fateful morning when she had been summoned unexpectedly to the manor's grand hall, she felt something she had never truly experienced before in her uncertain, servant's life. The solid, unshakable foundation of knowing exactly who she was, where she came from, and what she was meant to fight for. Lord Bramwell's formal trial for treason and conspiracy became the most talked-about event the royal court had witnessed in decades, drawing spectators from every corner of the kingdom eager to witness the downfall of a man who had spent 20 years building his fortune and influence upon the ashes of a family he had helped destroy. Alira sat beside Duke Alaric throughout the proceedings, watching with a complicated mixture of satisfaction and lingering grief as witness after witness came forward to testify against the man responsible for her mother's death and her own 20 years of stolen identity. Old Marta's testimony, combined with the former guard's detailed account and numerous financial records showing suspicious transactions immediately following the fire, painted an undeniable picture of calculated, cold-blooded conspiracy. Lord Bramwell, stripped of his earlier confidence and bravado, sat rigidly before the tribunal, his face pale and drawn as the weight of overwhelming evidence pressed down upon him with each passing testimony. When finally given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, he offered only weak, unconvincing denials that satisfied no one in the packed grand hall. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," the chief judge declared finally, her voice carrying the full weight of the crown's authority. "This tribunal finds you guilty of treason, conspiracy, and the orchestrated murder of the Veyron family. You will be stripped of your title, your lands, and your fortune, all of which will be transferred to the crown for redistribution as justice demands." As guards moved forward to escort Lord Bramwell from the hall, his eyes found Alira's across the crowded room, burning with a mixture of hatred and something that looked almost like grudging respect for the woman who had ultimately destroyed everything he had built. "You may have won this battle," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "But the Veyron name has enemies beyond myself, Alira. Do not imagine that your troubles have truly ended simply because I have fallen." His words hung ominously in the air as the guards led him away, and Alira felt a familiar chill of uncertainty despite the overwhelming victory she had just witnessed. Duke Alaric's hand found hers reassuringly, his grip firm and steady. "Do not let his final words frighten you," he murmured quietly. "A defeated man will always search for ways to diminish his enemy's triumph. Whatever threats remain, we will face them together, exactly as we have faced everything else." In the weeks following Lord Bramwell's conviction, Alira's life transformed in ways she could hardly have imagined during her years scrubbing floors within Ashworth Manor. Her family's ancestral estate, though damaged by decades of neglect following the fire, was formally restored to her ownership, along with considerable wealth and lands that had been seized by the crown following House Veyron's destruction and were now returned to their rightful heir. Nobles who had once mocked her origins now approached with careful respect, some sincere in their newfound admiration for her courage and resilience, others clearly motivated by opportunistic desire to align themselves favorably with a woman who now commanded significant influence and wealth within the kingdom's complicated political landscape. Alira learned quickly to distinguish between genuine friendship and calculated ambition, a skill she suspected would serve her well throughout her new position in noble society. Duchess Margaret's attitude toward her shifted as well, though the transformation came slowly and with considerable reluctance. The older woman had witnessed enough of Alira's strength and grace throughout the tribunal and subsequent trial to grudgingly acknowledge that perhaps her son's controversial choice had not been the reckless mistake she had originally believed it to be. "I owe you an apology," Duchess Margaret said one afternoon, finding Alira alone in the manor's gardens, tending carefully to a bed of roses that had become one of her favorite quiet retreats. "I judged you unfairly based solely on your former position, without ever taking the time to understand your true character. Your concerns were not entirely unreasonable, given the circumstances," Alira said graciously, though she could not entirely forget the older woman's earlier coldness. "A mother naturally worries about her son's choices, especially choices as unconventional as this one." "Perhaps," Duchess Margaret conceded, "but I should have trusted my son's judgment more than I did. Alaric has always possessed remarkable insight into people's true nature, even when his reasoning remains hidden from those around him. I see now that his instincts about you were entirely correct." Their relationship would never become effortlessly warm, Alira suspected, but this small gesture of acknowledgement felt like meaningful progress toward genuine acceptance within her new family. Lady Seraphina's situation proved considerably more complicated following her father's conviction and disgrace. Stripped of her family's wealth and social standing, she found herself suddenly without the comfortable, privileged existence she had always taken entirely for granted. Rather than fleeing the court in shame, however, Seraphina surprised everyone, perhaps most of all herself, by seeking out Alira directly one afternoon, her earlier haughty confidence replaced by genuine humility. "I owe you an apology," Seraphina said, echoing Duchess Margaret's earlier words, though her voice trembled with far greater emotional vulnerability. "I allowed my jealousy and ambition to blind me to my father's true nature. I suspected on some level that his business dealings were not entirely honorable, but I chose willful ignorance rather than confronting an uncomfortable truth that might have cost me my comfortable position within this court." "What will you do now?" Alira asked, genuinely curious despite their difficult history together. "I am not entirely certain," Seraphina admitted. "Without my father's wealth and influence, I have little claim to the social position I once enjoyed. Perhaps it is time I discovered who I truly am, beyond the privileged expectations I was raised to fulfill." Something in Seraphina's honest vulnerability resonated deeply with Alira, who understood better than anyone the disorienting experience of having one's entire identity suddenly upended by forces beyond personal control. "If you are willing to work honestly," Alira offered impulsively, surprising herself with the genuine warmth behind her words, "I could use someone knowledgeable about court politics and etiquette to help me navigate this new position I now find myself in. I know little about managing a noble estate or navigating the complicated social expectations of this court." Seraphina stared at her with genuine astonishment. "You would offer me a position, after everything I have done to humiliate and threaten you? We are neither of us the same people we were when this entire situation began," Alira said thoughtfully. "Perhaps it is time we both discovered who we might become, given a genuine opportunity for growth and change." Seraphina accepted the offer with humble gratitude, and over the following months, an unexpected friendship slowly developed between the two women, built upon mutual respect earned through shared adversity, rather than the superficial alliances that typically governed relationships within the royal court. Meanwhile, Alira's relationship with Duke Alaric deepened steadily, evolving from the careful, duty-bound arrangement that had characterized their early marriage into something far more genuine and deeply felt. Freed from the constant threat of Lord Bramwell's schemes, they finally had space to discover each other as individuals rather than merely partners bound together by circumstance and shared danger. One quiet evening, several months after Lord Bramwell's conviction, Duke Alaric found Alira in the manor's gardens, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. He approached quietly, standing beside her without speaking for several long moments, simply enjoying the peaceful companionship that had grown so naturally between them. "I have been thinking," he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence, "about how our marriage began. Rushed, secretive, born entirely from necessity and danger rather than genuine choice or affection." "I remember," Alira said, glancing at him curiously, wondering where this reflection might be leading. "I would like to ask you something," Duke Alaric continued, turning to face her fully, his gray eyes uncharacteristically vulnerable in the soft evening light. "Not as an obligation born from duty or protection, but as a genuine choice made freely, without any external pressure or danger influencing the decision. Alira, would you choose to remain my wife, not because circumstances demanded it, but because you genuinely wish to share your life with me?" Alira felt tears gathering in her eyes, moved deeply by the sincerity behind his unexpected question. Their marriage had begun under such strange, frightening circumstances that she had never truly considered whether she might have chosen this path freely, given the opportunity. "Yes," she said softly, without hesitation. "I would choose you, Alaric, freely and completely, exactly as I have grown to know you these past months. Not the Duke who protected a frightened stranger out of inherited duty, but the man who has shown me kindness, respect, and genuine partnership throughout everything we have faced together." Duke Alaric's face broke into a genuine smile, warmer and more unguarded than Alira had ever seen from him, and he gathered her gently into his arms as the last light of sunset faded slowly into the gathering evening darkness. Their story, which had begun with such shocking uncertainty in the manor's grand hall months earlier, had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. A genuine partnership built upon mutual respect, shared courage, and hard-won trust forged through adversity. Alira Varen, once a nameless servant scrubbing floors in obscurity, had reclaimed not only her true identity and rightful inheritance, but had also discovered something far more valuable: a genuine sense of belonging, both within herself and within the family she had chosen to build alongside a man who had risked everything to protect her, long before either of them understood how deeply they would come to care for one another. The royal court, once so quick to mock and dismiss her, now watched with quiet admiration as Duchess Alira Varen Ashworth took her rightful place among the kingdom's most respected and influential nobles, her remarkable story serving as a powerful reminder that true worth had never depended upon birth or circumstance, but upon the courage, resilience, and integrity displayed when facing life's most difficult and unexpected challenges. 6 months after Lord Bramwell's conviction, a sealed letter arrived at Ashworth Manor bearing no return name, only a wax seal stamped with a symbol Alira did not recognize, a black raven clutching a broken chain in its talons. Clara delivered it with visible unease, and the moment Alira broke the seal and read the contents, the color drained from her face. The letter contained a single warning. It named 3 noble families, allies of Lord Bramwell who had profited quietly from the destruction of House Varen 20 years earlier and had never been named in the tribunal's investigation. It claimed these families had grown alarmed by Alira's restoration and intended to act before the crown could uncover their own hidden involvement. The letter ended with a chilling promise that Alira would not survive the coming harvest festival unless she abandoned her family's estate and disappeared quietly from court life forever. Duke Alaric read the letter twice, his expression hardening into the same cold determination Alira remembered from their very first meeting in the Grand Hall. "We take this seriously," he said without hesitation. "Whoever sent this knows details that were never made public during the trial. This is not an empty threat." Alira felt fear coil tightly in her stomach, but beneath it, something steadier had taken root over the past months, a resolve she had not possessed when she first arrived at the manor as a frightened servant girl. "Then we prepare," she said firmly. "We do not run, and we do not hide. If there are more conspirators hiding within this court, the harvest festival may be exactly the opportunity we need to draw them into the open." They brought Edmund Blackwood and old Marta back into their confidence immediately, along with a handful of royal guards loyal to Duke Alaric personally rather than to the court at large. Edmund began quietly searching historical trade records for any financial connections between Lord Bramwell and the three families named in the letter, while old Marta, drawing on decades of quiet observation among noble households, offered insight into which families had suspiciously increased their wealth in the years immediately following the Veyron fire. Three names emerged clearly from their careful investigation: House Calloway, House Thornbury, and House Merritt, each of whom had acquired valuable trade routes and properties that once belonged to House Veyron within a single year of the fire, far too quickly to be simple coincidence. Duke Alaric approached the crown with this new evidence, but the reigning monarch, wary of destabilizing the court further so soon after Lord Bramwell's dramatic downfall, insisted on undeniable proof before authorizing further action. Without a confession or clear evidence connecting these families directly to the conspiracy, formal charges could not proceed, leaving Alira dangerously exposed as the harvest festival approached. The festival itself was held in the palace gardens, a grand affair drawing nobles from every corner of the kingdom to celebrate the season's bounty beneath strings of lantern light and blooming autumn flowers. Alira attended alongside Duke Alaric, outwardly composed despite the guards positioned discreetly throughout the gardens, and the tension coiled tightly beneath her calm exterior. It was Lady Seraphina, now working closely alongside Alira and intimately familiar with the subtle currents of court gossip, who first noticed something amiss. She pulled Alira aside near a quiet hedge maze, her voice low with urgency. "Lord Thornbury's steward has been asking unusual questions about your evening schedule," Seraphina whispered. "He wanted to know precisely when you intended to walk through the eastern garden path, away from the main festivities." Alira's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. "Then perhaps it is time we gave him exactly the opportunity he is looking for," she said, "on our own terms." That evening, as darkness settled fully over the palace gardens, Alira walked deliberately toward the eastern path, accompanied by what appeared to be only Clara for company, though Duke Alaric and several disguised guards trailed carefully at a distance, hidden among the shadowed hedges. Alira's heart pounded as she walked slowly along the quiet, lantern-lit path, every sense straining for signs of danger. A figure emerged suddenly from behind a tall hedge, dressed in dark traveling clothes rather than festival finery, a long blade glinting faintly in the dim light. Alira froze, her breath catching in her throat, but before the figure could take a single step closer, Duke Alaric and the hidden guards surged forward from the shadows, surrounding the would-be attacker before he could react. The man was quickly subdued and disarmed, and under firm questioning back at the palace guardhouse, he confessed within hours to being hired by House Thornbury to eliminate Alira quietly during the festival's chaos, making her death appear to be the unfortunate result of a robbery gone wrong. This confession, combined with the financial evidence Edmund had already gathered, finally provided the crown with undeniable proof needed to move against all three remaining conspirator families. Within weeks, House Thornbury, House Calloway, and House Merritt faced formal charges before the tribunal, their carefully hidden involvement in House Veyron's destruction finally exposed to public scrutiny. Their titles were stripped, their ill-gotten wealth returned to the crown, and the conspiracy that had haunted Alira's family for 20 years was finally, completely unraveled. Word of the failed assassination attempt and the subsequent collapse of the remaining conspiracy spread rapidly throughout the kingdom, and rather than diminishing Alira's standing, it only strengthened the court's respect for her courage and resilience. Nobles who had once viewed her restoration with skeptical curiosity now regarded her with genuine admiration, recognizing in her story a rare example of justice triumphing fully over decades of buried corruption. As winter settled over the kingdom, Alira and Duke Alaric hosted a celebration at their restored Veyron estate, inviting not only the nobility who now sought their favor, but also the ordinary villagers who had once whispered rumors about a mysterious woman leaving a child at an orphanage doorstep decades earlier. Old Marta was given a place of honor at the celebration, finally able to release the guilt she had carried for 20 years, knowing that her desperate flight through the forest had ultimately preserved not just a single life, but the eventual restoration of justice for an entire family. Standing together beneath the same estate that had once burned in flames of betrayal and greed, now rebuilt and filled with warmth and laughter, Alira turned to Duke Alaric with a contentment she had never imagined possible during those frightening early days of their unexpected marriage. "We did it," she said softly, watching the joyful gathering spread across the restored gardens. "Together." "We did," Duke Alaric agreed, taking her hand gently in his own. "Though I suspect this is only the beginning of the life we are meant to build together, Alira, not the end of our story." She smiled, looking out over the estate that represented both a painful, tragic past and an extraordinary, hopeful future, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, the complete and unshakable certainty of belonging exactly where she was meant to be.